called Ryan Callahan.
Oh.
But now we have Ryan Callahan coming on, and Ryan Callahan. I will not call you Brian Callahan. Welcome into the Blaine and Mickey show.
Instead, we'll just ask you, are y'all related?
Yes.
Even though it's not even spelled right the same way, is it?
No relation, but last names are spelled the same. It'll be cool, though, to have to do a double take every time I'm watching a Titans game. Like, wait, are they talking? Oh, never mind, not me.
I would just take credit if I were you. You know, if you're in a bar or something and people ask you about it, just say, yeah, I didn't want to leave GoVols247, so I'm just coaching the Titans in my spare time.
Especially if everything's going good. Yeah, if it's going bad, like, no, we're not related.
Yeah, I don't even know that guy. Yeah, for sure you can
Exactly.
say that. All right, so here's where we are. Tennessee and Virginia attorneys general, not attorney generals, attorneys general. They make their case. Now we have a temporary injunction where the NCAA can't enforce these NIL rules that they really didn't have in the first place. How long does this particular temporary thing last? You know, what's the timeline for this?
Yeah, I guess that's sort of the mystery of all this. We're obviously not legal experts, and we have to put on that hat here as sports writers. But as best I can tell, there's no set timeline on sort of when and there is apparently still another step of this that there does need to be a permanent injunction put in place for this to remain sort of the law of the land when it comes to the NCAA not being able to enforce its NIL rules or guidelines from before. Now everyone thinks this is pretty much a dead issue for the most part going forward, that this essentially is the nail in the coffin for the NCAA in terms of being able to really do anything in regard to limiting NIL or affecting the role of collectives in NIL and things like that. But they're, they still do need to go down that road and maybe have another hearing at some point. But yeah, as far as when that might take place, there's been no date set. There's no indication of exactly when that might happen. And I would guess that's probably months down the road, probably not days or weeks. So we'll just have to wait and see about that. But yeah, the case isn't officially permanently done, but everyone I've spoken with believes, that this preliminary injunction essentially is a pretty strong signal that this is a dead issue for the NCAA, and there's really nothing they can do going forward.
Well, and in the meantime, and as Blaine and I like to say, in between time, if I was everybody, I would just have every booster just throwing cash at people. There are no rules right now. I mean, the court said there are no rules. So is everybody just going straight bananas right now with their money? They could be.
Well, the reality is, and this is kind of the silly part about the NCAA trying to go after Tennessee to begin with, I really don't think there was any restrictor plate on this to begin with.
Right.
I think it was always sort of the Wild West. It certainly was before the NCAA came out and tried to put some guidelines in place a couple of years ago. They were slow to do that, slow to react, couldn't foresee what NIL might become, and the fact that there were no limitations on that without them saying anything publicly. So, this has kind of been wide open to begin with. And, so I don't think this ruling necessarily changes anything. There might be some schools that now say, okay, if we weren't up to speed on our collective, and this would probably be more small programs, lower level programs, things like that. You might say, okay, we've officially got to get up to speed on this. There's no reason to hold back now. But for the most part, I think it was kind of business as usual. But the NCAA was kind of going after cases where, people were maybe just being too loose with the rules. You had the Florida State situation where an assistant coach got slapped on the wrist for taking a player to meet with the collective, things like that. And then otherwise, it was just the cases where there was public acknowledgement or public reporting about an NIL deal, and a significant one. And that's obviously kind of what we think drew their attention to the Tennessee case with the reported deal for Nico Iamaleava. There was the Florida case, Jaden Rashada, that whole mess down there kind of caught their attention. So if it's not a deal like that, that's the crazy thing about this. The NCAA was never going to be able to police this because so many of these things are just happening behind the scenes. These are essentially deals with privately owned businesses. There's no way to police that. The NCAA has no subpoena power, so they were never going to be able to keep track of this, and there was really no need for schools and collectives to ever slow down in that regard.
There you go, Ryan Callahan. He never slows down covering the Vols for GoVols247. He is at Ryan Callahan 247 on Twitter.
Well, Ryan, it is Combine Week for the National Football League, and it made me think. You are covering the SEC in Tennessee, of course. Wonder if the SEC had their own combine. What would that look like? Do you like that idea or you don't?
That I would love that. I mean, pro days are not bad. If you've been to one before, it's you'll sometimes have like Tennessee will sometimes have some other in-state guys in town to help sort of make it worth everyone's while. Guys from Tennessee Tech or ETSU, places like that will come over when there's someone like that on the NFL radar. But yeah, to have that for one SEC school, bring everybody, make it a big event. I mean, that'd be pretty amazing. I mean, everything's a made-for-TV event these days as it is. I don't see why you wouldn't do the same thing with that. And the SEC could probably say, hey, who needs the NFL combine? We'll have the SEC combine, and it'll be a bigger deal than the NFL.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at, because you may have to have 2 or 3 of them because there's going to be so many players from the SEC.
Yeah.
And you move to different schools. I mean, man, that'd be awesome.
They would, and to your point, there are always some SEC players, and I mean, obviously this is true for other conferences too, but especially in the SEC, I feel like there are always players who are in that late round range or undrafted free agent range where they end up sticking around in the NFL and getting a chance on a practice squad or making a team out of camp and making the 53-man roster, despite being undrafted. For teams to get more of a look at all SEC players like that, there would be a ton of interest, obviously, because some of those borderline draftable players might end up drawing a ton of interest based on a performance at an event like that. And yeah, obviously the fan interest would be off the charts, I would imagine, for SEC teams. So yeah, I'm all for it. I think you're onto something there.
Yeah, I think Sankey needs to, send me a residual there on the pay there once they start that up here next year. But the orange and white game is coming up. How are they going to, facilitate, I guess, attendance with the construction, I guess, going to renovations of Neyland Stadium?
Yeah, the attendance will be limited to 10,000 fans for that, and that's obviously not ideal for a spring game, considering Tennessee usually draws a significantly bigger crowd than that. It's been 40, 50,000 a lot of years at least. So that's there's some fans that frankly, when they heard that announcement, were not thrilled, but it was kind of the best of a few bad options Tennessee had for a spring game. They had this issue a couple of years ago too, where they ended up having no spring game. Essentially, it was just on their practice field, and they sort of streamed it on a big video screen across campus for fans to sort of tailgate, sit outside, and watch it. And obviously, only so many did that. It wasn't a huge attended event, but it was still the best they could do under the circumstances, because they're in the middle of this sort of multi-year major renovation that's needed for Neyland Stadium. So they looked into 2 years ago, and this year again looked into the possibility of having an off-campus spring game, looked into the possibility of just not really doing one at all, and kind of having one on the practice field again. And that's obviously not ideal either. So this one gives you a chance to host recruits, which would not be the same type of option for an off-campus spring game. You wouldn't be able to interact with them because it's off-campus. So this gives you a chance to interact with recruits, still get all the benefits of a spring game, just not as many fans involved. And it'll still be streamed. Fans can watch it, but for at least one more year while they continue these renovations, it is going to be a little bit limited. And it is what it is, I guess, under the circumstances.
Well, you got McIntyre here from the state here, BA quarterback. I hear he's helping build the recruiting class. So what does that look like? How's that recruiting class going?
Yeah, it's off to a pretty good start. It's Josh Heupel's 4th year, so I think some of that you see just the continuity there, the fact they've not had a lot of coaching turnover, that's sort of paying off as well. So you've got a lot of things kind of converging to help, but they're off to a good start because they've already got 6 commitments, which for February is a pretty good number for Tennessee. They tend to be a little bit slower building classes because they do so much out-of-state recruiting historically, and that just takes a little more time usually to build relationships and get players to jump into your class. But they're off to a good start and in good shape with a lot of other guys. And, they sort of had this same type of opportunity with Nico Iamaleava a couple of years ago to be able to try to build a class around him. But, I kind of point out to people that was a little bit different situation 2 years ago. Tennessee was coming off a 7-6 season in Josh Heupel's first year. There just wasn't as much buzz around the program at that time, not as much to sell. And you had a West Coast quarterback trying to recruit a lot of other players across the country. You got George McIntyre now, who's well-known in AAU circles from basketball. He's been on a bunch of visits to schools all over the Southeast and has met players there and at Tennessee. He's recruiting a lot of guys in Tennessee's regional footprint that he knows pretty well. So I think given that and the situation with Tennessee's program now compared to 2 years ago, he's going to have a chance to bring some pretty good players with him, and I think he's pretty optimistic based on the feedback he's gotten from a lot of receivers, especially offensive linemen, that he's going to be able to help build a pretty good class around him at Tennessee. So we'll see how it shapes up, but I think he's pretty confident Tennessee's going to have a top 10 class at this point next year.
Ryan Callahan, GoVols247.com.
All right, the Hitman brought up how many people actually get to see the spring game. Let me ask you this. Of the freshmen, maybe especially the early enrollee guys, who are some names that maybe as the fall camp rolls around that you truly think these dudes are going to be in the mix to help this team?
Yeah, that'll be really interesting because last year I feel like we weren't, Tennessee was in a position with a kind of a veteran-filled roster where we didn't really get to see a lot. And that class maybe didn't have quite as many guys just ready to step in and make huge impacts, just right away. This class has got a few more of those guys, and you've obviously had some veterans leave, opening a few more opportunities, but they still do have a good number of veterans on the roster too, so it still might be a challenge for some of them, but you've got a couple 5-stars, obviously. I think you start there in a lot of cases. Jordan Ross, edge rusher, that's a position where they've got some depth, but he's a really talented guy who showed in a couple All-Star games he can make some plays and has the talent that might just be too tough to keep off the field. So I would start there, and then Mike Matthews, the other one, wide receiver. Certainly that's a position where Tennessee could still use maybe an injection of some youth and some excitement there. So I could maybe see a guy like that having a chance to play early. And the other receiver, Braylon Staley, a 4-star out of South Carolina. I think both those guys have excited them at wide receiver. Peyton Lewis at running back, another guy, probably in line to be maybe the number 3 running back going into the season. We'll see how that shakes out, especially with a new position coach there. But I think those are a few of the guys that kind of come to mind. And then in the secondary, I certainly wouldn't rule out Boo Carter. He was a guy that made a name for himself quite a bit in high school, made plays on both sides of the ball. So whether it's special teams or in the secondary or wherever, I wouldn't be shocked if you see him work his way onto the field in some capacity.
All right, one last one from me. Quick pivot to basketball. They've been blowing out bad teams lately, which is what you hope a championship team will do, but they have a heck of a four-game stretch left coming up to close out the season with a lot to play for, including possible number 1 seed in the tournament.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun stretch run for them. They've obviously not been challenged a whole lot lately. They've also had some up and down moments as well. The first half of that Missouri game looked like they were in danger of being knocked off by a pretty bad team. So they've had some moments where you still aren't sure about their consistency in a way that might concern you for NCAA tournament play. But should be no issue with motivation for these last 4 games. Some really tough teams down the stretch and a lot to play for. Tied for first place in the SEC standings, so a chance to win the regular season championship and continue to improve their resume for a possible number 1 seed in the tournament. So. Should be a fun stretch run, obviously starting with Auburn tomorrow night and Bruce Pearl. And, he's given Tennessee fits quite a bit over the years during the Rick Barnes era. So we'll see how that one goes. But it should be a fun stretch run and certainly a lot to play for Tennessee.
Yeah, for sure, man. Tomorrow night is going to be a lot of fun. Always a lot of fun catching up with Ryan Callahan at Ryan Callahan 247, GoVols247 recruiting editor.
Well, last question, and that is, any exciting news on potential on some visits by some guys you say, this is a game changer?
It'd be hard to point to just one. I will say their first weekend practice of the spring is March 23rd, that Saturday. They have spring break that kind of gets in the way in early March of having a lot of visits but the first couple weeks of the month. But once they get to spring practice, a lot of guys will be on campus. And that first weekend of spring practice looks like will be a pretty big visit turnout for them. So I think some 5-stars and high 4-star types have already indicated they'll probably be in for that one. So that will be a big event. The spring game's always a big event. It should be a pretty good turnout throughout the spring. So you always have a good idea coming out of spring practice of how a recruiting class might shape up. I think we'll certainly have a good feel by mid-April of how much of a chance they really have with some of those guys. But should be some impressive visitors coming to town for sure.
Whoa, you got me all excited, and I didn't hear a name. You're not giving us names?
Well, no. I mean, there's a lot. I mean, when
wow, it's that many.
Well, we expect guys like David Sanders Jr., the number 2 player in the country, offensive tackle from Charlotte, North Carolina. He's expected to be at Tennessee at some point this spring. I mean, really most of Tennessee's top targets include in-state guys like Cameron Sparks at Baylor, Radarius Jackson, the wide receiver from Memphis. Those guys are expected to be in town. Even talk to a top 100 wide receiver, Marcus Harris, out of California, coming back already after being at Tennessee last month for the first time. He'll be in town on April 4th. So just a lot of guys like that, coast to coast. So it should be a pretty big turnout throughout the spring. And like I said, kind of hard to point to just one.
Gotcha. Cool.
Yeah, man. You come from California, get down here, get yourself some fried food and hush puppies and all the good stuff that they don't have in other parts of the world. I think I'd be hooked if I'd never had that stuff. We got all the good food down south. Ryan, always fantastic stuff. People can follow you on Twitter again at Ryan Callahan 247. Of course, GoVols247 for great coverage, literally 24/7. Thank you, sir.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, guys.
Yes, sir. He stays on top of recruiting, and he's the guy for them who's been covering all this lawsuit stuff as well. You can go to GoVols247. He wrote a lengthy article about all of it to kind of get you up to date on everything. All right, let's stay